I'm Olga Segura, the Opinion and Culture Editor at the National Catholic Reporter. Joining me today to discuss the 2022 Academy Awards are two of my favorite NCR Culture critics, Jose Solís and Sister Rose Pacatte. Jose is a Honduran culture critic and the founder-director of the BIPOC Critics Lab and the creator-host of Token Theater Friends. His work has appeared in the New York Times, the Toronto Star, the Washington Post, American Theater, TDF Stages, and Salon. In his latest essay for the National Catholic Reporter, Jose talked with the director of the Oscar-nominated film, The Hand of God, Paolo Sorrentino. Welcome, Jose.
Gracias, Olga and Sister Rose. It's a pleasure being here.
And our second guest is Sister Rose, who is a member of the Daughters of St. Paul and the founding director of the Pauline Center for Media Studies in Los Angeles. She is an award-winning film journalist and author or co-author of 15 titles on film and scripture, and media literacy education. For NCR, along with many of the wonderful critics, along with many of the reviews she has done, she interviewed Jessica Chastain about her Oscar-nominated role in The Eyes of Tammy Faye. Welcome, Sister Rose.
Thank you for having me. It's delightful to meet you and to meet Jose.
Likewise, I'm very excited to have you both because I love editing anything you guys do related to pop culture, and I'm grateful to be able to be in conversation with you both today. So my first question, I want to talk a little bit about inclusion at the Oscars this year. So last year was a record-breaking year at the Oscars with 9 actors of color being nominated, receiving nominations. How inclusive are this year's nominees? And either of you can sort of take it, but let's get into how inclusive this year's nominees are.
Well, if I may, that's interesting. So you go through the titles, like Belfast it's about Irish people. Coda is about deaf people, a deaf family. She's a child of deaf adults. Don't Look Up has a very mixed cast. Drive My Car is Japanese. Dune, well, that had kind of a mixed cast as well, a diverse cast. King Richard, again, diverse. Licorice Pizza, I don't know what you want to say about that, but Nightmare Alley, The Power of the Dog, West Side Story was very nicely blended and I think authentic. But if you go through it, male and female, Belfast, men, Coda, a girl's point of view, Don't Look Up, kind of a mixed ensemble. Drive My Car, pretty much male dominated. Dune, male. King Richard, male. That's, again, though, that was about the Williams family. Licorice Pizza, Nightmare Alley, very dark, but The Power of the Dog, men, West Side Story, probably more female oriented. But so then you can look at the directors as well, right? And how much, but we're pretty much in a male-female type of, we haven't even gotten that fixed yet. Never mind coming to inclusion of races and gender and faiths and things like that, or elements like that. So your question is pretty much a loaded one, but if the church thinks in centuries, cinema's only had a little over a century and they still haven't gotten it. We're not there yet, but at least hopefully we're working on it.
I completely agree, Sister Rose. It's incremental pacing and evolution in cinema. And you're right, it's only over 100 years old. So maybe we have to be a little bit patient with it. But I know that given everything that's been happening, especially over the past 2 years with the Black Lives Matter movement and this terrible pandemic that we're still in the midst of, we kind of hope that the Oscars and other industry awards, because it's not just the Oscars, it's the Grammys, it's the Emmys, it's the Tonys, they all tend to love nominating what they know, the things that they feel safe in. For instance, although you are completely correct in that Drive My Car is a male-dominated film, the performance by the lead actor in Drive My Car is probably my favorite male performance of 2021. And why isn't he nominated, for instance? It's because he's not, Leonardo DiCaprio. He's not, Robert Downey Jr. He's not famous in America. So Yeah, I want to see more diversity at some point. And for now, it's just like a matter of just like breathing, kind of clutching my pearls a little bit, and just hoping that next year will be better.
Yeah, thank you both for your responses. I agree with a lot of what you both have shared. And Jose, you're absolutely right. A lot of what you were pointing to, especially in the pandemic, a lot of us have been sitting with questions about what does it mean to be more inclusive, especially as we enter year 3 of a pandemic that has really forced so many of us to think about the art that we consume, who gets to tell these stories of the art that we are consuming. And I was really excited last year when I saw that there were 9, because again, right, everything like you both said, it's incremental. So even when it feels very small, last year the number was 9 out of however many numbers of awards that get handed out. That felt very, very big. So to see it, that number this year dropped to, I think it's 4 or 5, that to me, my first instinct was really, after all of the work that especially critics like you, Jose, who are critics who are in the Latinx community and who have been calling on Hollywood to be better. So thank you both for sharing that, sort of grounding ourselves in the incrementalism, but also realizing that like we are in a pandemic that is demanding that we are better and that we think about all of the many themes that people in these movements are calling us to think about. So on that note, I want to transition to what are some of the themes that you guys have seen that are most powerful across the nominees? What are some of the performances that might have stood out to you? What are some of the scenes even? You guys can get as granular as you'd like, but what are some of first the common themes that you are seeing in a lot of these films? And then we can delve into specific performances, but what are some themes that stood out to each of you?
Well, it's very broad, but certainly looking at humanity closer, not maybe Don't Look Up has a vaster um, array of humanity there. But for most of these stories, we're getting pretty personal. You know, we're looking at individuals and their stories. And I have to say that for most of the films, I really liked seeing that. Thematically, there it's all over the place. If you want to get down to it, I mean, with The Power of the Dog, which was not my favorite film. Everybody says it's going to win, and maybe it will, and it is artistic. And as one critic pointed out to me, it's, you know, you've got to look at the location of the place and how much that speaks to what was going on in the story. And yes, that's true. West Side Story was wonderful. Dune, I had a really great nap. Let's see. King Richard. Okay, I liked it. It was predictable, but I love Will Smith, so that's okay. Licorice Pizza went way up on my weirdness scale, but you couldn't beat the performances of Alana Haim and Cooper Hoffman. Boy, they were breakout performances. Nightmare Alley. Why? Just why? Maybe you can answer, Jose. I don't know. Drive My Car. I was blown away by that film. That I can't speak enough about it. I reviewed it for St. Anthony Messenger, but it's just going to be coming out in a couple of weeks. But I have to tell you that I was so moved by it. It's such a tender film, and it's about so much told in the lives of 2 very different people against the backdrop of Uncle Vanya in Japan with different languages, including sign language, which brings me to Coda. Coda is a film I would watch again. I would watch Drive My Car again. I would watch Belfast again. That's where I give my vote to the best picture. Will I watch it again? West Side Story, probably. King Richard, probably. Not sure about the rest.
You have given me the idea to watch Dune whenever I want to fall asleep, Sister Rose. So thank you for that. I might start doing that. So let's call it, I won't watch it, but I'll start it on HBO Max and then I'll just go to sleep. So yeah, I'll doze off again.
Because it doesn't get loud. It's, you know, it's nice and quiet. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great idea. Something that's very interesting was that in 2021, there's, you know, sometimes we can find threads and common themes in the movies because they're a reflection of what's been happening in, I don't want to say the world because it's very Hollywood-centric. In fact, all of this is making me think a lot about what the Oscar-winning director of Parasite, Bong Joon-ho, said after he won the Oscar. He said, I'm not paraphrasing him, but he said, these statues aren't really a big deal to me because this isn't an international film festival. It's super local. It's very local. And that's true. Like, you know, like when something like Drive My Car breaks into the Oscar race, that's mind-blowing because we are used to the familiar names. For instance, Sister Rose, Nightmare Alley was not my favorite either, but to answer your question, why is it in there? It's because it's Oscar-winning director Guillermo del Toro. So when Oscar voters start getting the pile of screeners or the links, I guess, because of the pandemic, they'll want to watch things that they're familiar with. They're going to watch the movies by Spielberg, by Guillermo del Toro, by, you know, the film starring Denzel Washington, Will Smith, Julia Roberts, although she's not in any movies these days, but they will want to go find what's familiar. It's very strange for them to open up their vision, I would say. It's a very narrow, Americentric, Hollywood-centric, sometimes Eurocentric view of the world, which is why, although it's a European movie, I was very surprised but exhilarated when Penelope Cruz's performance in Parallel Mothers got nominated, because it's the kind of thing that happens so rarely. But again, I mean, it's Penelope Cruz. She's an Oscar winner already. She's starring in a movie by Pedro Almodovar, who's won 2 Oscars. So it's always that, you know, we're gonna nominate someone from outside our group if we know who they are already. So it's very hard to break into that. And in terms of the themes, what's interesting this year is that a lot of these movies were pushed, the releases were pushed because of COVID-19. So for instance, West Side Story was supposed to have a huge debut in the winter of 2020, which means potentially last year we could have ended up having an Oscar race between West Side Story and Nomadland, and how strange that would have been. So because it was pushed the whole year, now we have it against, you know, going against Coda and The Power of the Dog and Nightmare Alley and Drive My Car. And it's something very interesting. It's my favorite thing about the race this year, I think, is that we have a rematch with Jane Campion and Steven Spielberg. The two of them were nominated for Best Director in 1993. And Jane Campion, who I thought should have won that year for The Piano, lost to Steven Spielberg. So Hollywood really loves those kinds of stories about, you know, like big competitions and like finally getting to have Spielberg and Campion face each other again. If Spielberg won, that would be, I don't know, like people would, like Vegas odds makers would probably quit their jobs because Jane Campion has been amassing awards, and yeah, and it would be a surprise if she doesn't win. And also, she's the first director, the first women director in Oscar history to be nominated twice for Best Director, and that's a shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you both for that wonderful context and for all of the movie history that you're both bringing into this. I really appreciate that. And I think you're both getting into what I felt sort of watching the Best Picture nominees as I was preparing for our conversation today. I went in expecting movies that were completely going to blow me out of my seat because they were going to be engaging with themes that I'm engaging with in my own work or in my own faith life, because I have also been radicalized in very specific ways throughout the pandemic. And I watched them, a lot of them, and I was like, these are stunning pieces. Like, these are wonderful pieces of art that look beautiful, but they still feel, like you were pointing out, Jose, something about them felt sort of very narrow and very Eurocentric in the way that Hollywood is very, very good at doing. And a lot of it did feel super, super local, even when it was touching on very real universal themes of humanity, some of the themes that you mentioned, Sister Rose, but there was something in it that I thought, oh, okay, white creators in Hollywood who have been very empowered historically love to see themselves, like you were saying, Jose, they love to see the stories that feel familiar to them, and they have conditioned viewers in particular to expect this as well. So for me, I just had a resounding feeling of like, even if all of the films were very different, and I'm specifically focusing in on the Best Picture nominees. Even though they were very different stories, they still felt as if they were appealing to that sort of super locality that Hollywood loves so much. So thank you both for helping me be able to like connect those dots a little more fully. So yes, go ahead.
May I share a piece of trivia with the two of you?
Of course.
Okay, so I'm currently based in my home country in Honduras, where I was born. And one of my favorite things to do, especially since I was little, was seeing how titles are translated, right? Like what titles movies get in Spanish. And for instance, this year we have something like Dune, which obviously became Duna, you know, the literal translation of the word Dune. But then when we get into the hyper-specific Hollywood kinds of stories, for instance, King Richard was giving the name Una Familia Ganadora, a winning family. And something like, Drive My Car hasn't showed up here, so we'll see if that happens. Nightmare Alley became El Callejón de las Pesadillas, literally, you know, Nightmare Alley. But to talk about hyper local, I was very curious to see how Licorice Pizza would be named. And it was named Licorice Pizza because it's such a specific LA kind of story that it really has no translation to any other language. In fact, I even saw that the German poster and the French poster, it's called Licorice Pizza. It's like distributors gave up, like, we're not gonna even try to give this another name. Why bother? So it's called Licorice Pizza all over the world.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Jose, because I am also someone who is always fascinated by how titles are translated. So to hear where they choose to translate things and where they just sort of gave up, it also makes me think, oh, do you just kind of assume that everyone's just going to know what you're talking about and know what this film is referring to? So speaking of Licorice Pizza, let's jump into some of these Best Picture nominees. So the nominees for Best Picture this year are Belfast, Coda, Don't Look Up, Drive My Car, Dune, King Richard, Licorice Pizza, Nightmare Alley, The Power of the Dog, and West Side Story. So of these films, and we can get granular here, which performances stood out for you, which didn't stand out for you, and why? What were some of the things that felt profound, if the movies felt profound to each of you? We could start with you, Sister Rose.
Well, I'll just go down the list. I loved Belfast. It was like Kenneth Branagh was channeling Ken Loach, who was just a fabulous film director, and using the black and white and using the child. That what brilliant performances, and what and the story it was telling of getting along and welcoming somebody who's different, or people who are different, and then need to leave in order to find peace. I mean, this, you know, when you think that there are over 90 million people on the move today because of war or upset in their family, this kind of connects right there. It connects right there. Coda, I just loved. It's such a simple story, but yet I can see from both sides now. I can't get it out of my brain. That song is an earworm. Have you noticed that? Just keeps playing over and over. But I just, I love it that Marilee Matlin said that if she told the director, if you don't choose deaf actors to play deaf roles, I'm out of this. Because the French version of this film, which was, they didn't use deaf actors, and there was a lot of complaints about the poor French sign languages that was used, and the deaf people had to rely on subtitles. So here they really made this accessible to everyone. Don't Look Up. Okay, I totally enjoyed it. I was right there with it, and I don't think it's kind of a messy film, but it's about a messy world, chaotic situation. So that's okay. I don't think it'll win, but I appreciate it. Drive My Car is right up there for me. Belfast, Drive My Car, Coda, Dune, you already know what. The thing is, that movie falls apart at the end. That's the problem with that movie. It doesn't hold. The center doesn't hold. And because of that, you wonder about the narrative logic and why they went so much for the cinematography, which you do want to render, you want to show, you don't want to tell. But here it just kind of fizzled out. King Richard, outstanding performances, great story about a family that we all know and love. Licorice Pizza, as I mentioned, it was a weird story. It made me uncomfortable to have this young kid, wanting to be in a relationship with, a woman in her 20s. But I thought she handled it really well. And these are goopy kids at 15, right? This is what happens. It's a slice of Los Angeles in somebody's experience, but again, a little bit of a messy narrative. And maybe that's why licorice pizza is licorice pizza, because who in their right mind would put licorice on a pizza? So Nightmare Alley, I just found it very depressing and hopeless. It was so dark for me. Sure, you can call it a great film, and it is. It's got all the elements of greatness, but again, if you're going to tell a story, well, every person makes their own meaning. That's what I got out of it. So I don't want to impose my meaning on anyone. But The Power of the Dog is a very artistic story and very strong and compelling, but unhappy, ultimately so unhappy. And yes, we get that, the whole homoerotic community among the cowboys that Sam Elliott is really taking big issue with as a cowboy, who plays a cowboy. But the thing is that these are realities in our world that we don't see. And here's Jane Campion bringing a possible scenario to us that maybe didn't occur, but could have and probably is occurring. And how do we treat our neighbor? That isn't what this is about so much, but a person who's struggling with his own identity lashes out. And when he thinks he finds a relationship or he finds a copacetic person, his own lashing out comes back at him. So West Side Story, what's not to love? I just loved it. I'm sorry that Rita Moreno didn't get a nomination. When she sang a place for us, I just lost it. I just thought that was amazingly beautiful. I love the street reality of it, as Steven Spielberg is saying in all the promos that we're watching on TV. Yes, I lived in New York for 13 years. I know I don't have your creds there, but I know the city, so I feel like it resonated with me. So I think I've made my preferences known. Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Sister Rose. And Jose, I'd love to share, to hear your thoughts on the Best Picture films.
I believe something that's also very important to talk about this year is the fact that, I don't know about the two of you, but back in 2020, there was a point where I wondered, will we ever go back to movie theaters? Will we ever be in community and together again participating in artistic events? Mm-hmm. Fortunately, because of the vaccines and because of masking mandates and all of that, like so many of these things came to happen. So a big part of what ended up as Best Picture nominees are those movies that are just incredible theatrical experiences. So for instance, something like Dune, I do get, because I still wanted to fall asleep during it. I didn't, Sister Rose, but I wanted to. But I get the spectacle of it. I mean, I cannot imagine even trying to watch Dune at home, even if I have a fairly big TV. But for instance, hearing you talk about West Side Story, Sister Rose, I remember when I was in the movie theater and the lights were dim, and you hear that, I'm gonna try to do it, so I apologize to the two of you, that at the very top, I got goosebumps because the sound in the movie theater was just like enveloping me, and just like it felt like a big hug from this art form that I love so much. And similarly with The Power of the Dog, I started watching it on Netflix, and I said to myself, no, I'll try to watch this on the big screen. And then fortunately, about a month later, I got the opportunity to see it in Mexico City. And again, I was, the vistas in New Zealand passing as Montana just like swallowed me. Like they just took me to another place, which is what movies are supposed to do. They should allow us to escape our reality, even terrible things like Don't Look Up. Like we don't want that comment hitting us anytime soon. So for me, it was a lot about what works as spectacle and also what works intimately. For instance, something lovely like the final moments in King Richard, which I won't spoil for people who haven't seen it, or the beauty of Coda. I ended up watching Coda because I was sitting with my mom and my brother, my youngest brother, who I call my baby brother, but he's in his mid-30s. And we were just hanging out on a Saturday, and we were like, why don't we watch a movie? And then we opened like the apps, and there was Coda. And then the three of us ended up watching Coda and had a lovely time. You know, we usually talk over movies when we're together. And for Coda, we were just silent. We were just enjoying the story so much and how warm and beautiful it was. So for me, there's this really interesting dichotomy. I'm not gonna get into like if one of those is better than the other. You know, watching movies on a big screen or TV, it really makes no difference to me. And I know that's a debate among like, you know, Monopoly type film scholars and critics. But it's really lovely for me to get to see that, you know, that I had the opportunity to do both the big show and also the smaller scale, more intimate version. Like I have ended up watching West Side Story at home, and it ended up playing just as beautifully as it did on the big screen.
Thank you, Jose. I really loved that. First of all, I loved that you grounded us back in the fact that movies are meant to help us escape our reality, regardless of what the story is. That's what movies are supposed to be. And I love, and you both have touched on this in different ways, the spectacle and power of where these stories are taking place. Because even if one of the films that really stood out to me was The Power of the Dog, because those scenes are just stunning when you just see these cowboys herding all these cows, and there's this mountain, and they're just staring at the clouds. And being someone who's been relatively stuck in her apartment, in a very small apartment in New York City, and who has, as you mentioned, Jose, we've lost a lot of these public in-person communal spaces, films like that, seeing that on screen, it just really, even if it's just for the 2 hours or so that the movie is on my screen for, it allows me to feel like I'm actually in that place. And it allows me to be like, okay, I'm going to put myself into Kirsten Dunst's shoes, and I'm going to walk through this experience and be able to just have a relationship with nature in this very, very real way. And I think that's what made Dune and The Power of the Dog in particular, even if they're not acting wise like my favorite ones, they stood out to me because something about both of them, aside from like the obvious things we can point to, something about it felt very spiritual to me and felt very religious, to be able to just kind of, a film that can ground me in my relationship to nature always feels like it can ground me in my relationship to God. So I appreciated that. I think a lot of the location and the locality of these films really sort of ground religious folks in very specific ways. So I just have one more question for each of you related to Best Picture in particular. Were there any, or maybe not just best Picture, maybe even films that were nominated for Best Actor, Best Actress, but was there anything that felt, even if it wasn't explicitly Catholic or religious, was there something that felt very like God was at work? It made you think of the ways in which God is at work in our universe. Were there any films or performances that made either of you feel that?
If I had to pick one just off the top of my head, it would be Drive My Car. Because of, you get a whole spiritual journey there of two different people. You also get, they're kind of self-isolated, but then being part of producing this play draws them out of themselves. And they go on this journey of grief, of self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others for harms, for, you know, letting go of the past in order to build a future. And isn't that kind of a lot of what the spiritual life is about? We're always, I think, in relationship, and we're relationship with others. And I always paraphrase this, and someday I have to get the exact quote from Gaudium et Spes, from the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World from Vatican II. Somewhere in there, it says, what is truly human is truly of the gospel. And what is truly of the gospel is truly human. And that's why in film, when we can see the human face, we see the face of God. And when we see films that talk about relationship and making space for others, I think that's a reflection of God's grace in the world. God's grace in storytelling, God's presence. So I mean, I've said the movies that really touched me most, but I would say that Belfast also to a certain extent, and Coda, but Drive My Car really took me by surprise.
Amen to everything you just said, Sister Rose. As Olga already knows this and knows it very well, I love stories about women, which is why it's such a pleasure for me to be talking with the two of you. Because I don't have to mansplain, obviously, and I hope I won't. But we know that historically, women have been neglected and underrepresented in every aspect of human life, right? Which is why I always celebrate stories that center the spirit of women. And I thought about two movies, two performances specifically. And, we are so used to seeing the genius of men being celebrated in film and literature and everything, right? Like a man, I don't know, comes up with hot water and he's gonna have a movie made about him. So it was so strange and so refreshing for me to see the genius of a women be celebrated in being the Ricardos. And, Nicole Kidman playing Lucille Ball. We all know that Lucille Ball was hysterical. But what this movie shows us are those moments of genius. And I connect genius to the divine, those moments where she knew exactly what to do with the scene in order not only to be funny, but also to be human, to be kind, to be compassionate to her character, to bring her public joy, which is what she wanted to do at all points. So every time in the movie when Nicole Kidman goes to that place, she's getting messages from God. She's telling, she's being told how to make people laugh, how to take people out of that misery and out of that boredom and out of the mundane and take them to a place of sacredness, because what can be more sacred than laughing together, right, and sharing joy with others. And the other movie that made me think a lot about a women's relationship with the divine and with God and with spirit was Spencer. We all know that Princess Diana had a tragic death. She was very young, and I always saw her as an angel when she was on earth. When I was very little, I thought she was like a woman who I imagined would like grow wings. When I was like looking at her, she was always shown doing kind stuff for others and showing, she was always helping the poor, working with Mother Teresa, for instance, and helping the world be a better place. But something that I really liked about Spencer, which reminded me a lot about movies that I loved growing up, like The Song of Bernadette. Obviously, I'm not saying that Princess Diana was a saint in any way, but I love that we see how much there is to learn from suffering. And that's not something that I would want for anyone, like people should not suffer. But in Spencer, we see how after she goes through a period of immense desolation, near the end of the movie, she finally finds a moment of consolation where she's able to look inside herself. She's reminded of what matters about being alive, and it's precisely that, being alive. She's told, you are alive, you can make change. And that's a very quiet movie, and I think it's mostly because I saw it as a prayer. The moments of silence were for me moments where Princess Diana through Kristen Stewart was allowed to ask God for messages, to ask God for help. So for me, it's those two women that best reflected how I feel, at least my relationship with spirit is. It's finding those messages in the moments that are truly quiet.
Thank you both. I don't think we can you guys hear me? Okay. Apologies. I can't hear you, Sister Rose, but I see that you are talking. So there might be some tech issue there. But thank you both. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts on spirituality, the themes that felt spiritual to you, themes that felt religious to you both. I want to just give you both the opportunity, and Sister Rose, I guess I can jump in and share this if your volume is not working. But Jose, where can those who are watching this conversation today follow you online, and where can they find more of your work?
Thank you, Olga. Sure, like everything I do goes on Twitter, so you can find me at Jose Solís Mayen, that's M-A-Y-E-N.
Thank you, Jose. And Sister Rose, I think your volume...
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, we can hear you now. Perfect. So where can people find you and your work?
Okay, so I also post everything on Twitter. It's Sister Rose Movies, SR Sister Rose Movies, or just Rose Pacatte. You'll find me. And you can also find me. I have a URL that takes you directly to the National Catholic Reporter, which is sister, spelled out, rosereviews.net.
Thank you. Thank you both for being in conversation with me today, and for sharing with our viewers just why I love featuring your film, theater, movie, pop culture reviews, everything over at NCR. And thank you to everyone for watching today. You can read more of Jose's and Sister Rose's work, along with all of our pop culture coverage over at ncronline.org. Thank you.
Thank you.